Ahoy hoy, humans. Um, so, I've always thought that socialism, communism is inevitable, right? Like watching Star Trek and they travel back in time and they go to a store to grab something and the person asks for money and they're like, "We don't have any money." and then and then they go outside the store and like one of the people who's underneath the captain goes, "What's money?" And I always thought that made total sense. That one day this whole scarcity thing would be a thing of the past and there would be no reason for capitalism anymore. But that I have no idea what that will look like or how we'll get there. But I do know that if things continue on and artificial intelligence takes over all human tasks, right, including building robots that help humans, right, that things will become so cheap and so easy and so available that charging people for stuff just won't make any sense anymore. That no one has to do any work ever again. But it'll be because of technology. Because in Star Trek, they have that thing that makes food for them. They just like get this little thing and they press a button and whatever food they want moleculizes or whatever. That's not a real word. So yeah, communism will happen. And I was just listening to this video, and it appears that Marx thought this exact same thing. Marx thought you couldn't artificially bring socialism to fruition, just like you couldn't tell weather when to rain. So it's interesting. So Marx, interestingly enough, thought exactly what I thought, that it's impossible to artificially bring about communism.
Marx had a brilliant polemical ploy, okay? Basically, he said anyone who talked about socialism was stupid and unscientific and should shut up. And they were just utopians. So he was the one who coined that term. And he said, look, socialism is going to come with the inevitability of the laws of nature, or the inexorable laws of nature will bring socialism about, okay? Socialism will replace capitalism just as capitalism replaced feudalism, just as feudalism replaced the slave societies of Greece and Rome. It's an ever upward movement towards the final stage of communism, okay, which some people claim that was sort of another stage with Marx. We had to pass through socialism before we got to communism, okay? So he said, this is a scientific doctrine, to understand that inevitably communism will come and it will be the final stage. And that therefore, if that is the case, it's like arguing about, whether it's going to snow tomorrow or not, okay? If it snows, it snows. I mean, it's a part, it's dictated by the laws of nature. You can't argue about the laws of nature. So everyone should just shut up. Okay, he didn't want anybody talking. Anybody who tried to discuss what socialism may look like was considered unscientific and utopian and crazy like Fourier. Okay. And he said that, in fact, there's nothing we can do to speed it up. Okay, just as there's nothing that we can do to make rain come sooner. Okay, if there's a drought, well, the laws of nature will dictate when that drought comes to an end. Same thing is true of socialism. So Mises always pointed out that Karl Marx always focused on capitalism and the contradictions in capitalism. I mean, he never really wrote about socialism, what it would look like, okay? And that was deliberate. So he called his work, his magnum opus, Das Kapital, capital, okay? Not socialism. He didn't talk about that at all. So that was kind of brilliant. And everybody, trying to escape this label of being unscientific, kind of became Marxists, okay? Now, they didn't all agree with everything that Marx was saying about capitalism, but they stopped talking about, you see people stop talking about what socialism would look like in the future. So that's where Mises comes in. Now, Mises claimed that apart from the incentive problem, there was another deeper, more profound problem with socialism. And that was that without a price system, socialism was impossible. So he stated his thesis as follows. Okay? He focused on a developed industrial economy with very complicated processes of production and many varied capital goods. And he said that a rational allocation of resources, that is, using the resources in their most highly valued uses to consumers or even for the planners themselves, requires market prices. Right? But because socialism abolishes property, okay, and you have only one collective or one central planning board owning all of the property or determining how it is to be used, all the property, productive property, you could still own your own home, or not even your own home, really, the clothes on your back, your food, and so on. You could own those types of things. But you couldn't own any of the productive factors, okay? That is a definition of socialism, the abolition of, if you look at all socialist plans, all of them want to get rid of property. So it's the abolition of private property in the means of production, okay? In land, resources, capital goods, and any other material means of production, okay? The laborer was permitted to own his own labor and even get paid wages. So Mises's argument was brilliant in its simplicity. Okay, he says, number one, socialism abolishes private property in capital goods and natural resources. Since the socialist state is the owner of all of these material factors of production, these non-human factors of production, they can't be exchanged any longer, okay? Without exchange, there could be no market prices. So if there's no exchange, if there's this one agency that owns everything, even if, for example, everybody's involved in making the decision, even if somehow you have a democratic decision-making, okay, about how to use the factors of production, the fact that they're not being exchanged and not being used according to the expectations and values of different minds means that you can really never generate any prices. So under socialism, because there's no market and no prices, the state cannot calculate the costs of production. It never knows whether it's using something for a particular purpose that is more or less valuable than other purposes that it could be used for. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment. And so without the calculation of profit and loss, as we have under capitalism, socialist planners cannot know the most valuable use of resources. And therefore, Mises meant this literally, a socialist economy in which you economize resources, you only use them for your most highly valued uses. A socialist economy is impossible, okay? He wasn't exaggerating. When I looked at his argument, I mean, even many Austrians would say, well, Mises is exaggerating. In fact, Murray Rothbard wrote me, when he wrote me a letter on an article I wrote about this, he said, well, even myself, deep down in my own heart, he says, I thought Mises was a little bit, was exaggerating slightly. He says, but now I see that, that you have shown that it was really impossible because it destroys the division of labor. There is no more division of labor. You can't determine where people and things that are productive best fit, okay? So, the key to socialism is not a lack of incentives, the fact that you can't get people to do what you want because you're not giving them the incentives to do those things. It's not a lack of knowledge that you don't know how to produce things technically, or you don't know what people may like, okay, in general, okay? It's the fact that there's a single will acting. So I want to read this. Mises says, the essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. It is immaterial whose will it is. It could be just one dictator, could be a central planning board, it could be everybody voting democratically about how to use things. Doesn't matter. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities within the whole social system. Now, why is that so important? Because when you have one will, you don't have different people with different values interacting on markets to form prices. Okay? One will cannot generate a price structure, a price system, which is very, very complicated. Okay? One price alone means nothing. You have to have a sort of an interconnected structure of prices to be meaningful. Okay? And those prices have to be able to change relative to one another to show what goods should be produced, what goods should be produced with a different technology, and what goods shouldn't be produced at all. All right? And I'll talk about this. So Mises pointed out that there are three preconditions of economic calculation. Private property in all stages of goods. People have to be able to own everything, all kinds of goods, all kinds of capital goods, factories, as well as natural resources, coal mines, diamond mines, sources of oil, fisheries, and so on. So you have to have private ownership, not only private ownership, but the second point, you need exchange. People have to be permitted to exchange these things with one another so that a market comes into existence and generates prices that can be used for economic calculation. And finally, there has to be a sound money. That is, there has to be a money whose value is not controlled by politicians. Now, socialism abolishes all three of these things, okay? And therefore, it makes economic calculation impossible, and therefore, it makes a rational allocation of resources, rational use of resources, impossible. Okay. So let me give you an idea of the calculation problem, a very simple example here. Mises said, look, planners, they have scientists and engineers that can inform them of all the different ways of producing a given good, or all the ways of producing different goods. That is, they can know their production function. In economics, a production function is a recipe for how to produce a particular good. Okay? And to produce any one good, there are many different recipes, okay, as we'll see. But let's take this recipe for a Detroit muscle car, a Chevy SS, which is no longer produced, unfortunately. And let's say you need so much steel, you need so much machine time, unskilled labor, engineering labor, factory space, kilowatt hours of electricity, gallons of paint. Notice that all of the units are heterogeneous. You can't add up tons of steel with gallons of paint, with kilowatts of hours. Okay? You can't know, just from the technical data, which the planners would have, you cannot know the cost of producing this particular automobile. Okay, now how is this problem solved under capitalism? It's solved through economic calculation. All of those resources that go into the production of that automobile have prices because they're all exchanged at every moment on the market. So there's always an existing price structure. So if you can conceive of producing any good, you can always know its cost of production. As long as you know the production function, you know how much of each input is necessary, you can find out the price of those inputs and calculate the costs. Okay. And because the price structure is ongoing, and because entrepreneurs are always aiming their production towards the future, entrepreneurs will then anticipate what the output price will be, the price of that automobile. And the comparison of the cost of production with the price of the product itself will allow the entrepreneur to know whether this will result in profits or losses. So in this case, let's assume that the car has a cost of production, which can be easily calculated, of $50,000. And the firm forecasts that consumers will be willing to buy the output that they're going to produce at $55,000 per car. Okay? Over and above all costs, including the opportunity costs of the capital they've invested and so on. So that's a $5,000 pure profit. And therefore, that indicates, one, that they themselves will benefit, but it also indicates to the economist, okay, that society is benefiting, that resources that would have been used to produce household appliances and bicycles and other things worth $50,000 because that $50,000 is what the entrepreneurs will bid for those resources, right? And so if you can get them for $50,000 by bidding against these entrepreneurs, and you can use them to produce something that's valued by consumers at $55,000, you are using resources that are undervalued and putting them into a higher valued use, okay? On the other hand, if the entrepreneurs anticipate that consumers will only pay $48,000 for this automobile, then they would be wasting resources and they would be losing some of their capital by investing. So the incentive is tied up with the calculation, okay? The incentive doesn't exist alone, okay? The calculation is the key, right? So they will not produce that good. Not only that, take the simple bumpers. I mean, we used to have steel bumpers, and that looked like the right thing to do, right? To have steel bumpers on automobiles because they're stronger and they withstand impact better. But now we have fiberglass bumpers. Why do we have fiberglass bumpers? Because even though fiberglass bumpers are the calculation is such that it's worth paying less for the fiberglass bumper and taking a slightly lower price for the car than it is for paying for a steel bumper. That is, people would rather undergo the repair costs than pay the extra amount for the steel bumper. So it's not just that. I mean, every single aspect of any good that's produced is subject to calculation. Airlines compete on literal inches between the seat and the seats, okay? So an airline will calculate that an extra inch of room will allow me to charge $10 more for each seat in the airplane, okay? But on the other hand, it will remove 2 rows of seats and cause me to have fewer consumers, paying prices for a particular flight. So bottom line is that even inches of airline of seat space for people is subject to calculation. Okay, everything is. Now, are entrepreneurs always right? No. I mean, GM lost tremendous amounts of money back in the 1980s when Japanese cars were introduced, and they didn't downsize their cars. They lost billions of dollars, as an example. Okay, and had the Reagan administration not bailed out the automobile industry by limiting through voluntary export restraints the amount of Japanese cars that were permitted to be exported to the U.S., Chrysler would have gone out of business, and GM would have been a lot smaller and much more efficient. Okay, so they make mistakes, but the point is they're able to calculate, and they are able to realize that the mistakes that they make, and then revise their anticipations of the future. Okay, whereas the socialist planner doesn't have the slightest idea of whether he or she is even making a mistake.